I've listened to some very interesting talks today, and the luncheon speaker, Robert Zubrin, actually anticipated some of the thoughts that some of the slides that I'm going to present to you. So I'm going to cover some of the same material, but in a bit of a different way, and I think it'll be interesting to you. I'm going to focus on a person who is the major voice of the optimistic school of economics, of the environment, of the human condition. Does anyone need any optimism in this room after this conference? Okay. If you'll go outside, it's a sunny day. A lot of energy coming from the sun, and it is not anticipated to cease. Let's see, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the intellectual influences of the modern classical liberal, libertarian, free market, and perhaps a conservative movement, because I want to get to Julian Simon, who I think is a major figure here. A lot of, certainly myself and a lot of other individuals were introduced to, you might call it human liberation theology, by Ayn Rand, reading an Ayn Rand novel. For me, it was a fountainhead the summer of my junior year in high school. And through some of Rand's ideas, we became introduced to free market economics. One of Rand's books was called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, and that was a bit of an introduction to free market economics. Like a number of others, I went from Rand to Ludwig von Mises, who died in 1973. I was reading obituaries about this great economist who had lots of answers to societal questions, and who was ignored by the mainstream, and that made me very interested. So I started studying von Mises, and through von Mises you can understand how a variety of government interventions have unintended consequences, assuming good intentions, which I often like to do, and which is sometimes justified. Understanding the nature of human action in the science of economics gets you to appreciate how a variety of government interventions have ill effects. The classic example being price controls leading to shortages, and shortages leading to allocation regulation, et cetera, et cetera. Now, another key influence is F.A. Hayek, and I understood him later. And I remember exactly where I was when I got the Hayekian insight, and really it builds on Mises about how overall there is an undesigned order in voluntary human affairs. With Mises, I understood what was wrong with government intervention and that markets worked, but I didn't really understand what's the big organizing principle here. And it is that the market is an undesigned order, that the knowledge for a rational economic order doesn't exist in whole form, that a government can know, understand, and implement, but the order of an advanced complex economy only resides in the individual mind, the mind of all of us, and that we use the price system to register or to impart our knowledge through all our roles on the supply side and the demand side, and out of this comes an order that was the result of human action but not of human design. So the idea of central planning, Hayek was able to build on other economists, the economists beginning with Adam Smith, to take the general invisible hand idea but to put it in wholly different forms. And Hayek wrote an article in 1945 called The Use of Knowledge in Society, which is one of the all-time greatest economic argument. But there's another key figure in the history of free market, pro-liberty thought, and that is Julian Simon. And Julian Simon's 1981 book, The Ultimate Resource, was read by F.A. Hayek, and Hayek did something he had never done before. He wrote a fan letter to Julian Simon, and Hayek said, you know, I thought what you were saying in this book was true. I always thought it was true, but I've never seen it develop the way that you developed it. And it was mainly an empirical case that I'll get to here in a minute. Simon's worldview being people are not the problem, people are the solution. So what I'd like to do is to, in a slightly different way from the previous speaker, look at the Malthusian paradigm that has historically dominated the energy narrative. I'd like to contrast the Julian Simon worldview that is really increasingly relevant. And it's essential to understanding the paradox, and Simon would say this is a paradox of increasing depletable resources. I'd like to share Simon's optimistic message with all the gloom around us. And there's a quotation of Julian Simon, quote, "I'm not an optimist, I'm a realist." Now, a lot of my talk comes from a book I wrote, and there's still good copies available. Like someone else said, you don't have to read my book, you just have to buy it. And there's a few copies out there, but in this book I have 5 chapters on the history of mineral resource thought, the idea of depletable resource. How did economists look at this versus the general basket of goods and services? And I'll start with doomism, which has always been in the intellectual vanguard, the intellectual mainstream. You know, from the beginning, doom and gloom, well, almost from the beginning. It does go back to Malthus's An Essay on Population, first published in 1798, as the previous speaker talked about. But from that moment until the present, the mainstream has been that pretty much doom and gloom. And John Holdren, Obama's science advisor, made a prediction, and he won't back off of it, so I'm going to say he still holds it, that by 2020, and that's coming up, right? That 1 billion people could perish from the results of climate change. So, you know, we'll see, but that's an example of the doomsday thought. Back to Malthus. Now, Malthus wrote this book. I'm not going to say he was in the employ of the East India Company and he was just a PR person who wrote a book to keep East India happy. No, I think the causality is reversed. That he had some ideas that at the time had some validity, but he was wrong. And his theory was basically that population increases geometrically to 2468. Is that right? Is that geometric? 2468? 24816? There we go. And agriculture increases arithmetically 1, 2, 3, 4? Well, okay, so what grade do I get? Okay, I'll do better next time. Have me back a year from now, I'll get it right. The difference being misery or vice, that human beings would have to perish through disease, war, starvation, and that was the lot of man. And this book was really a revolt against the happy economics that came out of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations of just several decades before. Now, applied to minerals, and particularly energy in this case, the sort of The Wealth of Nations, the key volume of energy economics, was written in 1865 by William Stanley Jevons, called The Coal Question, an inquiry concerning the progress of the nation and the probable exhaustion of our coal mines. And basically the message of this book was demand going up like this, the supply of coal like this, and that coal prices would increase. But what would happen was that the coal industry in the UK, which was the center of coal in the world, they were a major exporter, the supply would shrink up, it would become uneconomic, and that the youth of Great Britain would migrate away to places like the United States, where coal would be mined because it was a much greater resource. So this was doom and gloom, but it wasn't on a global scale, it was really for the UK. But out of this comes the fixity depletion view, because his model for the UK would also be eventually be the model for the world. And later economists, even economists in the classical liberal tradition like John Stuart Mill, they saw diminishing returns with human beings, with population. You keep adding population, at some point productivity stops increasing and in fact goes negative. If you have too many people tilling the field, at some point they start getting in each other's way. So what is the key assumption here? It's the other things being equal assumption that technology doesn't change, so you have more inputs of labor and productivity ceases and then goes negative. Some of these books were mentioned by the previous speaker. Generally a concern about increased human impact on the environment, but what has started in the 1860s and which is always present is the idea of fixity, that resources are like water in a glass. You take a sip and there's less and less. And it is a fixity depletion view, because once you make the assumption of fixity in a total amount of supply, any production and use reduces that. So fixity and depletion very much go the same here. I'm going to skip over some of these slides because they're very much in the tradition of what we saw with the previous speaker, but the general view of the population bomb. This is Paul Ehrlich's 1968 book, The Population Bomb That Sold Millions of Copies. Paul Ehrlich was on Johnny Carson's show like 12 times. Anyone remember Johnny Carson in this room? Yeah. We all used to go to bed with Johnny Carson. Was Julian Simon ever invited to be on Johnny Carson? No. But the Ehrlich view was put in a simple mathematical equation, I equals PAT. Impact, the negative impact on the environment is equal to population times affluence times technology. Okay? So, more people, more affluence, more technology, and any sort of combination will increase the negative impact on the environment. We talked a little bit before about the limits of growth, the Club of Rome. But a major point of the energy crisis, which really accelerated the idea of fixity, depletion, and running out of resources, we can look back to Richard Nixon and his price control order of August 1970 as one of the most important single acts that helped the mirage of Malthusianism fool so many people. Now, the previous speaker talked about the Arab embargo as being key to the energy crisis. Another view is that price controls on crude oil and petroleum products were starting to cause shortages in the United States well before the Arab embargo. And here are some covers of congressional hearings, one on fuel shortages, the other on energy conservation, both months before the Arab embargo, which was in October. This was February, March. So what we see here is that, and Milton Friedman used to say, economists don't know much, but there's one thing we do know. You have price controls, you'll get shortages. And this was happening with different oil products. We weren't in the gasoline lines yet, but at the wholesale level, between wholesale and retail, there was a lot of problems, and the oil companies were trying to figure out how to ration supply and the rest of it. So it was getting bad. And the law that became the Emergency Petroleum Allocation Act after the embargo, actually that law was already drafted and going through Congress before the Arab embargo. So the United States was starting to experience an energy crisis from a couple of years of price controls before the Arab embargo. And this is a very important insight. And notice how energy conservation comes into play. Oh my gosh, that's a way of life for us today, energy conservation. But it took price controls and shortages to create this whole new field of energy conservation. And the father of the energy crisis and the energy politicization we have all around us today is Richard Nixon. Now, jumping back, there's a very important journal article in economics, the most important essay ever written in the field, called The Economics of Exhaustible Resources by Harold Hotelling in 1931. And he basically said, with perfect knowledge, where you know there's a fixed supply, that usage or production of this supply has to be at increasing cost, because you're going to start out with the lowest cost and you're going to successively get to the higher cost portions of that supply. So as a depletable resource, the economics are different. What you have is a user cost or an extra cost because of the increasing cost of mining the reserve. Hotelling said that basically a depletable resource will increase at about the rate of interest. It's an extra bit. It's a scarcity premium, what they called Hotelling's user cost, that makes this different from other goods and services. And the article, it was very mathematical. It used calculus, but it's basically correct. If given the assumptions, his analysis is correct. But people didn't think much about it, because in the United States, we didn't have oil shortages except for during wartime when we had price controls. We had too much oil. just a year or two after this article came out, the National Guard closed down fields in East Texas and Oklahoma City because the price of oil, barrel of oil, was down to 10 cents a barrel, about the price of a bowl of chili in Tyler, Texas. And the battle cry of the industry was, "We need dollar oil." This theoretical idea of Harold Hotelling that prices of oil, gas, coal, any mineral have to go up year after year was totally irrelevant. But when the energy crisis hit, as one MIT professor said, every week there was an article in his inbox, some new article on Harold Hotelling and the oil crisis. He became the dominant economist, or his model became the dominant model of economics through the 70s. And even places like Resources for the Future that were once had a very optimistic view of oil, they now became depletionist. Jimmy Carter and his energy czar, the first DOE Secretary, James Schlesinger, need I tell you more? And you know, it used to be I would buy all the books that came out on, you know, oil depletion and running out of oil, but there's so many of them, I stopped buying them. But there was something like 50 books that came out on peak oil type themes, and all sorts of magazine articles. So you're very familiar with this. And of course, we have gone from Jimmy Carter to Barack Obama. Maybe there's a similarity there. Maybe Photoshop, though, too. Against Malthusianism, believe it or not, there were some expansionists. The most well-known of these is the gentleman on your right, Julian Simon. The second gentleman, Maury Edelman. Some of you may have heard of him. He's still living, MIT economist who has done a lot of great work explaining really the oil as we understand it today. The first gentleman, Edward Mason, Harvard professor, he actually did some very good work in the 1950s against the depletionist view of resources and energy in particular. And the gentleman next to Simon on your right, Eric Zimmerman, is an unknown to many people, but some of his ideas are very salient, and he really, his ideas foreshadowed, or he anticipated later arguments of Julian Simon. Now, some of the books that came out of Resources for the Future, a think tank that was founded in 1953, I believe, from the Ford Foundation, all sorts of books on resources, energy, and they were very, very good. And Fred Singer, I know that you are familiar with some of these books. And the book Scarcity and Growth, The Economics of Natural Resource Availability, is really a classic. So Resources for the Future did real well, but then the energy crisis hit and they went Malthusian, so to speak. They bought into the Harold Hotelling idea of fixity, depletion, higher cost, higher prices. Eric Zimmerman was an economist at the University of Texas. He was a member of the Institutionalist School, and he had some wonderful ideas in his book that came out in 1951, World Resources and Industries. He says resources are not, they become. What are resources today weren't resources, didn't have any human use in the past, and there's some resources that were once very important that aren't resources anymore because there's not a human need. So the idea of resources comes from the mind, or human need. And his statement, knowledge is the mother of all resources. So to Zimmerman, resources don't come from the ground, they really come from the mind. So the shift is from the raw material to human ingenuity. And the term natural resources is really a bad term, because these resources are really manufactured resources. And it's a very important point against the fixed depletion view, is that you shouldn't look at so-called depletable resources or minerals any differently from the general basket of goods and services, if you're a business person or if you're a policymaker. Now, Julian Simon didn't know very much at all about Eric Zimmerman or some of his ideas, but he sort of rediscovered the ideas that Zimmerman had. And Simon began as a Malthusian, and he explains this in his autobiography. He thought there was a positive correlation between human beings and less resources and more negative environmental impact. But he looked at the data and he had to change his mind, and the correlations that jumped out at him from all his empirical research was that more people were correlated with economic and environmental betterment, and certainly in those areas where they had a free economy or partially free economy. So Simon comes up with this idea called the ultimate resource. What is the ultimate resource? Human ingenuity. And Simon was a great marketer. He was an excellent businessman. And look at the cover of his book. He just comes right out in 1981 against his critics. Natural resources and energy are getting less scarce. Pollution in the U.S. has been decreasing. The world's food supply is improving. Population growth has long-term benefits. This is completely contrary to the mainstream view. And in Science magazine, Simon got an article published on these thoughts, and Paul Ehrlich and the others wrote the editors of Science and said, how in the world could you publish such a piece and all the rest of it? And that eventually led to the famous bet that Robert Zubrin mentioned earlier, or it's in his book, between Simon and Ehrlich. I'll get to that in a minute. So this new view of Zimmerman and Simon, which is counterintuitive on the face of it, that depletable resources are expanding resources. Why? Well, empirically, you can look at the data and it's all there, but how do you explain this? And the explanation is that knowledge is not a depleting resource or a finite resource. Knowledge is an increasing or a cascading resource. The more informational breakthroughs we make increases the possibilities for future breakthroughs in knowledge. And the other thing that's changing, that is not ceteris paribus, is that in a market economy under capitalism, the financial capital that you need to actually mine minerals is going up. So over time we become energy richer, we get more substitutes, and rather than depletion, we have open-ended expansion. There's a term that was coined not by Eric Zimmerman, by one of his disciples that I really like, called resourceship, or entrepreneurship applied to minerals. And in the Zimmerman view, human ingenuity takes the neutral stuff of the earth and turns it into resources. Resources might be speculative, probable, proven, but as we consume proven resources, there's increasing amounts of resources to take its place. And the history, if you look at the history of resource estimates for oil, gas, coal, or any other mineral, they are increasing over time despite record consumption. The exact opposite of what you would expect under the fixity depletion view. What is world energy usage, oil, gas, and coal so far compared to what we believe is left? There was actually an estimate from the IPCC from 2001 that's getting a little dated, about 1.4%. I think now the square would be much bigger. The black part would be a little bigger because we're finding energy much faster than we can ever use it. And by the way, uranium, nuclear for electricity, it can't compete. We don't need it. Maybe in another century or another millennia will that come into play. Nuclear plants just can't compete against oil, gas, and coal-fired plants around the world. The famous bet of Ehrlich and Simon, pick your mineral, pick your year. Simon won it. For some of these, he would have lost for other decades. But in general, it's probably a pretty good bet. The fallacy of fixity is there's really no glass. Sure, you can make an assumption that you know all the supply, but that's just a hypothetical in your mind. In the economic world and the business world, with any mineral, we don't know how much supply there is, and as a matter of fact, you can't know how much supply there is because technology takes what is the neutral stuff of the earth and turns it into resources. Okay, a few quotations from Simon, and then I'll open it up to questions. One of them, and this drove Ehrlich and Holdren crazy. He said, "It is reasonable to expect the supply of energy to continue becoming more available and less scarce forever." Now, the key assumption that Simon would sometimes make and sometimes not make is that you have a free market system, you have private property rights, profit loss, the rule of law, and the rest of it. Another quotation that drove his intellectual opponents crazy: "The trend toward greater availability includes the most counterintuitive case of all oil." Now, Simon recognizes that it is counterintuitive, and it's hard to explain to people why depletable resources are expanding and will continue to expand. And part of the problem we have generally in education, the free market versus progressive, government fix-it ideas, is it takes a lot longer for us to introduce concepts such as resourceship or undesigned order than it is for proponents of government to say, problem, pass a law. Good intentions, fix it. Realism and optimism. I'd like to quote with this, or end this talk with this quotation from Simon. He says, "The message to young people certainly is not one of complacency. In this I agree with the doomsayers that our world needs the best efforts of all humanity to improve our lot. I part company with the doomsayers in that they expect us to come to a bad end despite the efforts we make, whereas I expect a confirmation of humanity's successful efforts. And I believe that their message is self-fulfilling, because if you believe your efforts will fail because of the inexorable natural limits, then you are likely to feel resigned and therefore to literally resign. But if you recognize the possibility, in fact the probability of success, you can tap large reservoirs of energy and enthusiasm." And Julian Simon's last public talk was here in Houston in the Galleria area, and the title of his talk was "More People, Greater Wealth, Expanded Resources, Cleaner Environment." And that's an optimistic message we all should have, but we know what the challenge is, and that is government intervention. in the economy that immobilizes resources and that can actually destroy resources. One more quote from Simon. The world's problem is not too many people, but the lack of political and economic freedom. So with that, I'll open it up to questions or answers.
I'll make one interesting comment. You go back quite a ways, and now I do remember Harold Hotelling, and he was quite a popular guy in the 1970s. Also had a chance to see Friedrich Hayek at Berkeley. He came there for a while. So this was really a wonderful presentation from my standpoint. It's deja vu. Norman Borlaug, is that a name that's familiar to you? Because I think he had a remarkable effect on the increase in production of crops. I mean, miraculous. And I think that would be a sort of an exceptional example of what Julian Simon was talking about.
Right. If this was a Julian Simon talk in agriculture, he would be a very key person. Yeah, he just turned around. It was like the hydraulic fracturing revolution with oil and gas. He sort of did all that with his green revolution. Yes, sir.
This time it won't be a facetious question. I'd like to know more about how you concluded that it's going to be a long time before nuclear energy is appropriate or efficient to use. Today, if I'm not mistaken, Switzerland gets 70% of their electricity from nuclear power. Swiss, yeah. And so how did you conclude that its time hasn't come yet, if I understood you correctly?
Yeah, I need to clarify the point where I say nuclear is not competitive. I mean for new capacity. Once a nuclear plant is built, the price of uranium is low enough where nuclear could well be the cheapest electricity source. It's always base loaded. But for new generation capacity, and one expert here is Robert Peltier, the editor of Power magazine, a real free market guy. He tracks the relative costs for new capacity of nuclear, gas-fired, coal-fired around the world in the industrial countries. And nuclear cannot compete against gas-fired generation and coal-fired generation by a not insignificant amount. Now, the other part of nuclear's problem is it's very capital intensive. It's up front. So to finance a nuclear plant, you need a long-term contract for the electricity, 10, 15, 20, even more years. With a gas plant, many more of those can be built at a smaller scale, and they can be more spec, where you don't have the long-term contract because there's a lot less capital cost. So nuclear plants really thrived under public utility regulation when they became part of the rate base, where the utility company loved nuclear precisely for the fact that it is more capital intensive and they can earn their rate of return on a higher capital cost. So in a market, in a competitive electricity market, nuclear has additional problems. Fred?
Yeah, there's currently a huge price gap between natural gas and oil in BTU terms. How do you see this gap developing in the future?
Well, in the old days, it was sort of a 6-for-1 BTU ratio. I guess that was a barrel of oil versus a million cubic feet, but that's out the window. And oil and gas really aren't the substitutes they used to be. It's a lot more natural gas for electric generation and much more oil for the transportation market.
Well, if natural gas can substitute in transportation, natural gas either directly or compressed or LNG or as methanol or as as gas to liquid, eventually the gap will have to be closed, won't it?
Well, technologically they're substitutes, but economically they're not. For all the existing cars, who's going to pay $3,000 to turn them from oil to gas, and who wants to give up their trunk for a gas cylinder? For new cars, it's a problem too. Part of it is, the refueling problem. And, Boone Pickens wants the federal government to have a $64,000 tax credit for 18-wheelers to convert from diesel to natural gas. That's what it takes. But it looks like politically he's not going to get that. Yes, sir.
I think you're right about the operation of nuclear power plants, if they're already built, as you know. Palo Verde, for example, generates electric power at 2 cents a kilowatt hour. The problem of the high capital cost of nuclear power is an American problem caused by American regulation. In other countries in the world, it costs 4 or 5 times less to build a nuclear power plant. That's why the Chinese are building 50 nuclear power plants right now. Our problem, and you're right about the capital cost of nuclear power in the United States, that's not an engineering problem, that's a political problem.
I think the problem in China is that it's not a competitive market. And this is a question for Robert Peltier at Power Magazine. I'm not saying that I have any information he doesn't. But if you look at the levelized cost in China and other countries of the world of electricity from nuclear power plants versus coal plants in China, there's a significant difference. Coal smashes nuclear. And coal plants can be built on a smaller scale. But it's really, the nuclear industry has been government subsidized from the very beginning with Price-Anderson and particularly on the insurance side of things. I agree that environmental regulation has significantly increased nuclear cost here in the United States. How much of that is legitimate? How much of it is illegitimate? We would have to have the private market, private insurance market help us with that. But with Price-Anderson Act, it's been subsidized ever since 1954. So I love nuclear in the sense that it's a backstop technology, but I just can't see the viability of nuclear, even in the past, without federal subsidies and the malincentives of rate-based regulation on the state level under public utility regulation.
Well, you see this, I don't want to argue with you, but this is just wrong. In Oregon, for example, in nuclear power plants, they're starting to build modular ones, small units they can put together for a big one. We have a company in Oregon that's trying to build nuclear power plants that are about 1/10 the size of normal, and if you want a big one, you can combine them. These people face 15 years of delays before they can even build a prototype. If that were true of coal power, you wouldn't be saying what you're saying. Thanks very much.
Just briefly, I want to second what Arthur said. It's nonsense to say that the nuclear power plants' capital cost is so great and that's why it can't be done. This is strictly an artifact of government regulators. It used to take us 3 years to build a nuclear power plant in this country. It's now an average of 16 years because of all the delays they put in the construction process and all the opportunities they create for interveners that are allied with the regulators to intervene and thereby pose business risk that you won't even be able to open up the plant after you complete building it, as happened, for instance, to the Shoreham plant in Long Island. Vicious overregulation and capricious actions by politicians. And also, I must say, because I used to be in this business, in fact, I used to be involved as a government regulator from the Washington State Office of Radiation Protection, overseeing the Trojan plant in Northern Oregon. And let me tell you a story about that, okay? Because Trojan plant was being forced to shut down about once a year for several months because they had corrosion in the pipes in the secondary loop. And the utility knew what the problem was, and there were certain pipes they wanted to replace. They were carbon steel. They said, we're going to put stainless steel there and won't have this problem anymore. The NRC said to them, if you do that, you will be changing your design and you will have to reapply for your license. Okay, so therefore, they couldn't make a change at their own expense that they wanted to make to improve the plant because of these insane regulators would basically have shut them down forever if they tried to improve their own product. That is what the nuclear industry has been laboring under. So this stuff of, oh, no, nuclear can't compete, this is just baloney. Now, the second thing, okay, to move on, to the subject of methanol, okay, which can be made from natural gas and is not science fiction. This is one of the top 5 chemical commodities produced in the world today and is currently selling today on the spot market without any subsidy for $1.40 a gallon. Okay? Now, fact of the matter is that flex fuel cars can run on methanol. That's point 1. Point 2 is all cars sold in the US for the past 5 years actually have flex fuel capability built into them, but the manufacturers have elected not to turn it on except in a tiny minority of the cars. I demonstrated this by taking a 2007 Chevy Cobalt, which is not a flex fuel car, but has the exact same engine in it and the same computer in it as the HHR, which is a flex fuel car, and I simply got into the software and turned on the flex fuel capability, okay? And it ran great on E85, it ran great on 100% methanol, okay, until, for a while, then there was a problem with the fuel pump seals. We took out the fuel pump. We saw that they were using Viton seals. We replaced them with seals made of Buna-N, which cost 41 cents. And since then, it has run perfectly on methanol. Now, this car gets 36 miles to the gasoline highway on, 36 miles to the gallon on a highway with gasoline. Gets 24 with methanol. The methanol is selling for $1.40 a gallon. That's 40% miles per dollar on methanol, okay? So, it is entirely competitive. The problem is twofold. Number 1, the car makers, because of penetration of their management, okay, by interests representing Arab sovereign wealth funds, okay, has elected not to make this conversion themselves. And number 2, the EPA bans private conversions. They say it is tampering with the car to do that on a commercial basis. They'll prosecute you if you do that, okay? And they also accordingly ban the sale of methanol as part of motor vehicle fuel at more than 5.4% concentration. So to say that methanol is not in cars because it can't compete in the free market is utter nonsense, because we have foreign interests blocking the automakers from doing it themselves. We have the government regulators blocking private individuals from doing it on the bottom up.
Okay. I'm sure there's a lot of horror stories, certainly about nuclear and U.S. regulators. If nuclear was so great, why in 1954 did the federal government have to pass the Price-Anderson Act to socialize, to put
because
on
of fear?
Taxpayers? Hold on, let me finish. You spoke for an hour there. You spoke about 10 minutes there. And another revisionist point. When nuclear first came out, and I'll be happy to make a monetary bet with you, there were environmental groups in favor of nuclear.
Certainly.
I have that. Would you like to make a bet on that?
No, I fully agree.
Well, that contradicts what you said before in that room and in this room.
No. Environmentalists support all new technologies until they become practical. Then they turn against them. Okay,
well,
if wind ever becomes economical, they will become anti-wind.
Why Price-Anderson Act in 1954? To put on taxpayers.
That's 50 years ago.
Well, it's been renewed every year. It's still the law of the land. Why not get rid of Price-Anderson today? Or why didn't, I mean, nuclear's if it wasn't for government intervention, we would not have a nuclear industry.
Or airlines.
Or
airlines. You know, or railroads, or ports, or canals. There's been plenty of government intervention that is...
So government has given us everything we have?
No, but there's a certain role of government in...
Not like a Price-Anderson
in promoting
Act.
Technology. But there's no doubt that since the 1970s, the government has acted to wreck the nuclear industry.
It's done a lot against the nuclear industry. Okay.
One
But
comment. One
this
comment.
nuclear problem is, I mean, the left loves wind and solar, the right loves nuclear, and there's a whole lot of government intervention and central planning on
I don't
both
want to
of them.
get into the nuclear argument again, but I will say one thing. I do a lot of work in the shale gas area, and there is no one in this room that can conceive of how much shale gas is in the world. Whatever you think there is, multiply it by 100 to support your point, Mr. Bradley. Nothing will compete with shale gas. It's in every country. Shale is everywhere. Every other country is 10 years behind because they own their mineral rights and it'll take them 10 years to get going. We own our own privately, and that's why we're there. But I have to support what you have to say because the world will be awash in shale gas for a millennium at least.
Okay, we're right at 3 o'clock. You want to get back on time?